craven, a hunter, who uses all the methods of the animals.
This Thursday.
Once you're on his list, there's only one way off.
Are you like your father?
He puts evil into the world. I get rid of people like him.
Who's next?
Witness the making of a new Marvel villain.
You think you have some kind of honor? You're a criminal, just like our father.
Aaron Taylor Johnson is Kraven the Hunter. Rated R. Under 17 on admitted without parent. In theaters Thursday.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. Well, here we are, Matt, episode 10 of season 2, our final episode of a really enjoyable first year.
Yes, really enjoyable, very enjoyable indeed. And yes, it's our 20th episode of 2024. It's flown by, hasn't it? I know I speak for both of us when I say we've had great fun doing the pod this year, but it's not over yet. We've got one final episode to go, and this is it. And if you were listening last week, you'll know that we're closing Series 2 with Part 2 of our mini-series, a two-part series on the man, the myth, the legend, Bernie Ecclestone.
Yep. In last week's episode, we described Bernie's rise from used car and motorbike salesman to the most powerful man in Grand Prix racing. A journey that saw him through stints as a racing driver, a driver manager, and a team boss, among other things, on the way to becoming F1's commercial rights holder, or, as he was often described, its ringmaster. And this week, we're picking up the story from 1987 onwards. And if you remember, that's when FOTA, the organisation we know today as FOM, or Formula One Management, was formed, after Bernie stepped back from running the Brabham team, and then flogged it off for a tidy profit, of course.
He was always good at doing that.
He certainly was, always. And this was the beginning of Bernie, as I imagine many of our listeners will remember him, a diminutive figure pacing the F1 paddock in that familiar crisp white shirt and dark slacks.
Yes, and I was once told by someone who really would know that Bernie used to put on a brand new crisp white shirt every single day when he was at a Grand Prix and chuck the one he'd worn the day before in the bin. It wouldn't surprise me. Would it surprise you?
Not at all.
I mean, it may, of course, not be true, but it's absolutely in keeping with his obsessional devotion to neatness. And I have to say, I've never seen even a speck of dirt on any of his crisp white shirts in the 30-odd years that I've been working in and around Formula One. I doubt if you have either.
No, never.
Never. Anyway, I'm going to kick off now with a great quote from a mutual friend of ours. Here's what the BBC's Formula One correspondent Andrew Benson wrote about Bernie Ecclestone in 2017, which I think really captures Bernie's essence and sets the stage well for the period of Ecclestone's life that we're going to talk about today, when he really did rule the Formula One paddock. So here goes, quote, this is by Andrew Benson of the BBC. Despite his diminutive stature, Ecclestone is a forbidding character. Stories abound in Formula One of real and threatened menace. A conversation with him is akin to juggling sand. He ducks and dodges and avoids questions with obfuscation, distraction, and quick wit. A dizzying mix of truths, half-truths, and fallacies. He is approachable, but apart, engaging, but unknowable. After a verbal sparring match, he will sometimes reach up and chillingly pat you on the cheek, not unlike a mafia don. in the movies. That's not only a fine piece of writing, but also a very accurate description, isn't it, Richard?
Juggling sand, I love that.
It's a great phrase.
And Andrew Benson is as fair and scrupulous a journalist as you'll find in F1, so I'm happy to endorse his description. And I'll go a little further from one perspective. For those of our listeners who've never met Bernie, the easiest way to get an idea of what it's like to be in his presence is to watch The Irishman, the movie Martin Scorsese made for Netflix in 2019 about gangsters in Philadelphia in the post-war decades. It stars Robert De Niro and Al Pacino and Joe Pesci, who steals the film. If you watch his brilliant performance as a miniature mobster called Russell Bufalino, you'll get the idea. He never raises his voice in public, but as Andrew Benson said about Bernie, there's a hint of menace underlying every word, every gesture, and every look.
Yes. I mean, Bernie likes to catch you on the hop. When I was a journalist and a magazine editor, I'm going back a few years now, working in Formula One, I mean, he'd occasionally call me and he'd always get straight to the point. It'd never be, hello, Matt, this is Bernie. You wouldn't even get that. He wouldn't engage in pleasantries. He wouldn't say, how are you? Wouldn't say any of that, because he'd always want to come straight out with whatever it was that had caused him to call you. And it was usually a complaint of some kind. To be fair, he was always okay with me. I mean, I never put the phone down in mortal fear. But he often made it abundantly clear that I'd transgressed in some way, and I'd better not transgress in the same way ever again. Sometimes, to be honest, I'd be surprised that he'd bother with the transgressions of a bit player like me, but that was his style. He was always an attention to detail man as well as a big picture thinker type of man, and he always managed to find out about almost everything. And I think that was because people used to love telling tales to him, because they tended to think it would advantage them in some way to do so. Anyway, he mostly stopped calling me once I joined McLaren, because then obviously he would call Ron Dennis or others. But while I was a journalist, I sometimes used to get these calls. Anyway, going back to 1987 and the formation of FOTA, which you mentioned, Richard, it's worth noting that Ecclestone formed FOTA with the understanding of the teams. Obviously, they knew that he'd keep a good chunk of TV revenues for himself and for FOTA. Not surprising to hear that, obviously. But they also knew, or he'd convinced them, that the overall size of the pie would get bigger and bigger under his stewardship. And actually, to be fair, it did.
And how?
And I think in those early days, TV revenues, trackside signage income and paddock club income were split so that the teams, from memory, I think this is right, correct me if I'm wrong, they got a 47% share to split among them. And of course, there were more teams then than there are now, so it wasn't split 10 ways, it was split more than 10 ways. And the FIA...
Probably not 10 even ways.
Never. Never.
If you were LaRousse Lamborghini, you probably...
Yes, very Orwellian. Yeah. All men are equal, but some men are more equal than others. Anyway, the FIA, the sport's governing body, of course, got 30%. And FOTA, Bernie's new organisation, took 23%. FOTA also received all race promoter fees, but it would use at least some of that to pay prize money to the teams based on championship position. It was a complex formula.
I think it was.
It was.
I think probably only one man understood it.
And he understood it very well. Yeah. Anyway, what happened next? Well, I suppose at this point we should mention, as we often do, Bernie's old chum, Max Mosley, because together they ruled the roost in Formula One from 1991 to October 2009. Now, if you remember, Max and Bernie formed a great double act at the helm of FOTA.
Yes, Bernie was the iron fist in Max's velvet glove. I think that's how you put it, Matt, in the last episode.
Exactly, well remembered. Anyway, Max, as a trained barrister, provided the legal expertise as a perfect foil to Bernie's commercial savvy. But actually, in 1982, not long after the first Concord Agreement was signed, Max left his role at FOTA, by the way, Formula One Constructors Association, FOTA, to work in UK politics for the Conservative Party. He had ambitions to become a Tory MP at that time. However, in 1986, with the support of Ecclestone, Mosley returned to motorsport, becoming president of the FISA Manufacturers Commission and sitting on the FISA World Council. And that was important because once in place, Mosley, the silver-tongued enforcer, is said to have suggested to FISA President Jean-Marie Balestre that Ecclestone would be easier to deal with if he were part of the establishment, not a rogue outsider working with the teams. I can just imagine Max finessing that persuasion. Anyway, so towards the end of 1987, Bernie was duly appointed vice president of the FIA, or one of them, with responsibility for promotional affairs. I mean, that was an extraordinary move, wasn't it, Richard? I mean, Bernie had once despised FISA and the FIA, and now here he was, finessed into that position by his old partner in crime, not technically crime, Max Mosley, poacher turned gamekeeper, working for the FIA.
Yeah, but of course it was all part of a wider play for Max and Bernie to gain more influence. Max's heart's desire really had been to succeed in politics. I'm sure he'd seen himself as a future Tory Prime Minister, not only as a future Tory MP.
I think you're right, actually, yes.
Yeah, but he discovered pretty quickly that being the loyal son of the leader of the pre-war British Union of Fascists and the post-war far-right Union movement was an insuperable handicap.
Yes, and you're referring to Oswald Mosley, of course, Max's dad, who was imprisoned at the outbreak of World War II, along with Max's mother, Diana Mitford, later Diana Mosley, of course, and indeed the infant Max himself, Holloway Prison, which was a woman's prison at the time in North London. Anyway, now, 85 years later, only people interested in history, such as you and me and others, have probably heard of Oswald Mosley or know much about him. But after the war, after the Second World War, and certainly right up until the 1980s, which was when Max was exploring his own political ambitions, his father's name was a serious handicap, not only in political circles, actually, but also in the country at large.
Well, he was the embodiment of the far right, wasn't he? Or the extreme far right. If you thought of that, you thought of Oswald Mosley.
Well, apart from, people like Hitler and Mussolini, but in Britain, you thought of Mosley. Yeah. Absolutely. Anyway, Max once told me that he thought the biggest problem for him politically would have been not actually at cabinet level or in Westminster, but at grassroots level within the Conservative Party. Local party organisations and so on. He thought that the people who worked for the party at that level would be spooked by the association with one-time public enemy number one, Oswald Mosley, as you say. And perhaps he would have been right there. Don't forget, those people's fathers would have fought against Nazi Germany in the Second World War. And Oswald Mosley supported, as I've said, supported Hitler, Adolf Hitler, and the Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini too. Indeed, and get this, Hitler was the guest of honour at Max's parents' wedding, which took place in 1936 in the drawing room of Nazi propagandist-in-chief Joseph Goebbels' house in Berlin.
Exactly. So once that party political option was blocked for him, Max settled for achieving his ambitions via motorsport, the one field in which nobody gave two hoots about his name and his father's infamy. And that meant becoming the president of the FIA. And it's important to understand this because Mosley was vital to Ecclestone's ability to get what he wanted. As you said, Matt, first Max became president of the Manufacturers Commission, giving him a seat on the FIA's World Council. He needed the support of Balestre as well as that of Ecclestone, but 5 years later he challenged Balestre for the presidency of the FISA, and he won. And 2 years after that, in 1993, he stood against Balestre for the presidency of the FIA itself, and he won that too. Job done.
Yes, job done, as you say. Of course, having his old mate Max in charge of the FIA was great news for Bernie. which was why they finessed it in that way. And during the following decade, the 1990s, the FIA, in other words Max, granted the commercial rights to Formula One management, in other words Bernie, and some of the team bosses, particularly Ken Tyrrell actually, were incensed by that. It's alleged that Ken once screamed at Bernie that he'd, quote, stolen Formula One, unquote, giving Bernie one of his famous froth jobs in so doing, which was what a bollocking from Uncle Ken was usually termed, owing to, I'm sorry about this detail, but owing to the spittle that he deposited on your face while he was delivering it. Anyway, it's true. He was a froth job deliverer.
A slightly less sanitary version of Alex Ferguson's hairdryer job.
There you go. Anyway, and it wasn't just Ken Tyrrell, actually, because McLaren's Ron Dennis and Williams' Frank Williams were also very upset about it at the time. And together with Tyrrell, they formed a kind of unofficial awkward squad, I suppose you could call it.
Yeah. The teams were asked to sign a new 10-year Concord agreement to run from 1997. And one of its provisions guaranteed Bernie a much larger share of the income than he'd been getting before. And when some of the teams complained that he was now making far more money out of F1 than they were, he replied, quote, "The commercial rights never belonged to the teams. They belonged to the FIA. And now they belong to me," unquote. What he'd done was realise that the ownership of the commercial rights effectively now meant ownership of F1. The FIA, which was nominally the governing body, was very happy to stand aside at that point and watched him do a better job than they could. And that's typical Bernie. And so was this. At one point, he offered to sell the commercial rights to the teams at a 30% discount on whatever price he had in mind.
I have to say, a 30% discount on what? For sure, he would have decided what he wanted and then said the price was 130% of that.
Exactly so. And it could never have happened anyway, partly because most of them didn't have whatever the money was going to be, and also because some of them simply refused to believe that it was his to sell. But it was, as we'll see.
Yes.
When he needed to get his own way, Bernie's favourite technique was to divide and conquer. And that's how he got the teams to fall in line, not just in this conflict, but several times in the future. It's a classic tactic. In fact, it goes back at least to a book called The Art of War by Sun Tzu, the great Chinese general, written more than 2,000 years ago. All sorts of people use it. Even nowadays, it's just, on strategy.
I've heard of the book, but
yeah.
I haven't read it. Tell us, you wouldn't mind giving us a tiny soupçon.
This is, and colossally, that's history, not the rest is history. So I can't tell you what dynasty it was from. But it's all about strategy and tactics, and divide and conquer is a typical one. So, Matt, if you're thinking of invading, a small country next month, then perhaps you better read it first.
I'll bear that in mind.
But the key to the success of the tactic was that he was owed favours by many of the team bosses. There was Frank Williams, for instance. He'd been bailed out by Bernie on more than one occasion when the team was in serious financial trouble. There's a lovely story in Maurice Hamilton's biography of Frank Williams. And Bernie talks about, in Frank's early days, Bernie's Brabham team would rebuild engines for Frank. And occasionally Frank would come in and say, "Bernie, can you lend me £5,000? And Bernie would say, "Sure," and sign him a cheque on the spot. £5,000, a lot of money in that.
Quite a lot of money.
Probably 3 Cosworth engines.
Yeah.
And anyway, they'd agree that Frank would pay it back in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And Frank would come back on the appointed date with a cheque for £5,000 made out to Bernie. Very satisfactory. But in the next breath, he would say, "Bernie, could you lend me £7,000?
So that I can pay the 5,000.
Yep. And the same thing would happen.
Yeah.
So the result of that was that Frank was someone who'd be prepared, in the right circumstances, to break ranks when Bernie needed it. Eddie Jordan was another one. Did they know that when he helped them, Bernie was making an investment that was about more than just keeping them in the game? When he needed their cooperation, he could be pretty sure of using it to undermine the other team's attempts at collective bargaining.
I reckon they did probably slightly know, but their backs were to the wall and they had no choice.
It probably didn't take them too long
exactly.
to realise. Anyway, and Ferrari was a bit of an exception. Bernie always understood the special value they brought to F1, and he always spoke very respectfully of Mr. Ferrari, as he called him.
He did indeed.
Eventually, it took the form of a special deal that gave the Scuderia Ferrari extra money, originally $90 million a year, no less, in recognition of their longevity. And its purpose was to ensure that they stuck around. And
so
stuck
far,
with him.
it seems to have worked.
Very good. And as you suggested, Matt, Bernie saw bigger pictures. When British American Tobacco, a giant tobacco company, wanted to get into Formula One, he put them together with Ken Tyrrell, whose team was in slow decline. And the deal enabled Tyrrell to get out with some money and BAT to come in with a platform for a team, British American Racing, BAR, that eventually adopted further identities, Honda, Braun, and currently Mercedes. Coming back to Max and Bernie, though, Matt, do you think they shared the same vision for F1, and were they motivated by the same things?
Well, I think they were, and that might surprise you, but let me explain. I remember interviewing Max in 1997 for F1 Racing, of which I was then the editor. And I asked him why it was that his partnership with Bernie worked so well. After all, on the surface, they were so very different. Max's father was a fascist baronet because he wasn't just Oswald Mosley, he was Sir Oswald Mosley. And his mother was one of the famous and aristocratic Mitford sisters, Diana Mitford. So as such, Max was related not only to Sir Winston Churchill, but also to the Queen Mother. I mean, imagine that. And he was expensively educated and taught to hunt and shoot, of course, in England, Ireland, France and Germany, before he went up to Oxford. By contrast, Bernie was the son of a Suffolk trawlerman who left school more or less as soon as he could to sell second-hand motorbikes in southeast London.
Yeah, in fairness, it's actually worth remembering that within 2 months of Max's birth in 1940, both of his parents were in jail, interned with
as you've said.
Interned with a lot of other British Nazi sympathisers, and they stayed there until 1943. And in those early years, Max and his brother, who I think was a couple of years older, were brought up by a nanny. A privileged upbringing, you could say, but maybe not an enviable one.
I think that's very well put. Exactly. So how did Max answer my question, which was, how come you and Bernie work together so well? I'm talking about the question I asked him in 1997 when I was interviewing him. Well, his answer was fascinating. He said, quote, and I'll read this, "We're both outsiders in terms of the English establishment. We're coming to that position from different angles, but we're both outsiders," unquote. And what he meant was that Bernie was a kind of Cockney wide boy made very good, and he, Max, was an exile from the social class that he'd been born into because of the notoriety of his father, and mother to some extent as well, during and after the Second World War. And I think what Max said was absolutely true. Max also said in the same interview, quote, and I'll read it again, "Bernie's great ability is that he's extraordinarily good at extracting the most from a deal. He thinks in a very original way. I tend to think in a more conventional way because I've had a more conventional education, but the two of us together make a formidable combination."
Well, in its way, it was a great partnership. And at one point, I remember that they even pretended to have fallen out. This was in some really big negotiation.
I remember that.
Was it over a Concord Agreement renewal or a cost cap or something like that? That they pretended to have fallen out and to be going in completely opposite directions. But like so many of their negotiating tactics, it was smoke and mirrors, and it was just played out to confuse the opposition, which it did.
It did indeed. And I think the team bosses tended to admire and fear Bernie. Or Bernie and Max, because they really were a double act when they were in their prime together, as you say. Did they like them? Maybe some of them did. To be honest, more of them liked Bernie than liked Max. Would you say that?
Yeah.
I think so.
True, yeah, very much.
Bernie was more obviously chummy than Max was. obviously. That was their natures. Bernie enjoys the company of people who are funny. He has a low boredom threshold. By contrast, verbose people, whether they have something valid or interesting to say or not, he loses patience with them. He really does. I'm sorry to say this, but he found Ron Dennis too verbose and therefore too boring. Martin Whitmarsh too, obviously Ron's deputy at McLaren for many years. Whereas the Eddie Jordans of this world were much more his cup of tea. Or even lower-ranking team people who could spin a yarn, such as Ian Phillips of Jordan or Bernard Ferguson of Cosworth. Do you remember them?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, great guys to have dinner with, you know. That's what Bernie liked. He liked and likes characters. I mean, he likes Flavio Briatore.
He likes Flavio Briatore a whole lot.
He does.
I mean, he always has done.
Well,
right
touch on that.
from the beginning. Yeah, we should actually just mention QPR maybe at this point.
Okay.
In 2007, they and Lakshmi Mittal, the steel billionaire, and Agag, the man who runs Formula E.
Alessandro Agag.
Alessandro Agag. They got together and bought Queen's Park Rangers, who were then languishing a bit. And let's say it didn't work. This was not Roman Abramovich taking over Chelsea. It just really wasn't. And if you want to know about that period of Bernie and Flav's partnership, watch a film called The 4-Year Plan, which is on streaming platforms, which is absolutely hilarious. It's an object lesson in how not to run a football club.
Really, yes.
Anyway, that's it. That's Flav. And he did Flav a lot of favours, like bringing Tom Walkinshaw and, by extension, Ross Brawn to Benetton.
Well, and Michael Schumacher.
In 1990, and Schumacher.
Yeah. Well, a bit of alliteration. Flav's failed football foray.
Yep.
And Bernie was involved in that as well.
Yep.
Anyway, he likes characters. He liked certain drivers too. He loved Michael Schumacher. He loved Sebastian Vettel too. And he liked a few journalists as well. I mean, the one that springs to mind for me is Roger Benoit. The veteran cigar-smoking Formula One correspondent for the Swiss newspaper Blick. Bernie loves him. They play backgammon together even now, and they always have done.
Yep. And the other thing that happened when Max became FIA president is that several former Brabham old boys from Bernie's era were moved into prominent FIA positions, giving Bernie even more influence over the governing body. And actually, it worked mostly to F1's benefit. The most significant of those former Brabham people was Charlie Whiting, who'd been 12 years old when he climbed over a fence at Brands Hatch near his home in Kent to watch the 1964 British Grand Prix. Charlie studied mechanical engineering, got into motor racing, and was Nelson Piquet's chief mechanic when the Brazilian won the world drivers' titles in 1981 and 1983, for Brabham, of course. And after Ecclestone sold Brabham, Charlie became the FIA's technical delegate to Formula One, and from that he became the race director at all Grand Prix. And he did that for 30 years until he died, very sadly, from a heart attack in Melbourne in 2019, 3 days before the first Grand Prix of the season. He did a brilliant job, particularly when you think of all the controversies he had to deal with.
Absolutely. And Charlie is much missed still. I mean, let's not even talk about Abu Dhabi 2021, because we could do a whole podcast on that. But I think it's safe to say that Charlie would have handled that race a whole lot better than it was handled by Michael Massey.
Yeah, well, perhaps we should wait until that's become history.
Everything in the past is history.
Yeah, Bernie trusted Charlie, and so did everyone else. I mean, how often have you heard people say, they've created something new for a car, and it might be stretching the rules a little bit, and they say, well, I took it to Charlie, and he said it was all right, and they did that knowing that Charlie wouldn't tell anyone else.
Yeah.
That if it was this piece of really secret, like a double diffuser, for instance, this really secret piece of kit, their secret was safe.
Well, the deal was, if he said it wasn't kosher, he told everybody so that they wouldn't waste money developing the same thing. Yeah. And if it was okay, then he wouldn't say a word.
Yep. Exactly.
To not betray
exactly
the team
right.
and
exactly right.
sacrifice their advantage,
Yep.
which they'd hard won.
Yeah. And as you say, you can see how good he was at the job by the mess the FIA have made with various race directors over the last 5 years, without Charlie's experience and judgment to call on.
Absolutely, sadly, yes.
And there was also his mate Herby Blash. He'd worked for Lotus. He'd been Jochen Rindt's second mechanic before joining Brabham. And he was the team manager there when Piquet won his world titles. He and Charlie formed a great partnership, and eventually they were reunited in F1, with Charlie as race director and Herby as his deputy, although he was also Yamaha's representative in F1, so on race weekends he wore a Yamaha shirt in the morning and an FIA shirt in the afternoon, quite literally.
Herby actually probably had more air miles than any of us, because he used to go to every Grand Prix and then every bike race as well.
Yes, indeed, for Yamaha. Yeah.
Mm.
But of course, not everyone appreciated the Max and Bernie show, which is what it had become. In 1999, as Bernie prepared to float the Formula One group of companies on the stock exchange, an inquiry by Europe's competition authority concluded that Bernie had broken EU competition law when he obtained exclusive television broadcasting rights to world motor racing events, rights he'd obtained from Mosley.
And the upshot of that situation was that the European Commission insisted on a separation of the commercial and the legislative. It was an anti-monopolies move by the European Commission, basically, that led in 2001 to the signing of the so-called 100-year deal, in which the FIA agreed to lease the commercial rights to the Formula One World Championship, including its trademarks, to Bernie's holding company in exchange for a one-time fee of $313.6 million and a few annual regulatory fees. And really, at the time when that was announced, I remember thinking that seemed a paltry fee given the money that Formula One was making at the time already. $3 million a year, or about £2 million in those days. The price of a comfortable semi-detached house in a perfectly nice but not super posh area of London.
Would that be your area, Matt?
Well, this is private matter. Would it be your area, by the way?
Certainly.
Anyway, the price of a comfortable semi-detached house in, Earlsfield, Wandsworth, or Twickenham near Richmond, those kind of places, for an entire year's commercial rights for one of the world's leading and most lucrative sports. I mean, Bernie's done a few good deals in his life, but that was one of the best of the lot.
Yeah, that 100-year deal was Max's gift to his old friend, and it was a gift that would keep on giving, as we'll see. One of the things they were sometimes accused of was manipulating the championship so that we'd always get the sort of grandstand finale that was so good for the show. For example, some people have doubted the legitimacy of the staggering three-way tie for pole position that we got between the title contenders Jacques Villeneuve and Michael Schumacher and the other Williams of Heinz-Harald Frentzen during the 1997 European Grand Prix at Jerez, the last race of the season. All three of them clocked 1 minute, 21.072 seconds. Do you believe there was merit in those stories, Matt? Was there ever skullduggery going on?
Well, let me put it this way. Bernie definitely did want the Formula One World Championship to go down to the wire every year. Occasionally, a few teams seemed, therefore, to get a better run of the regulatory balls than others, I guess you could say. And the FIA often appeared to join in, I thought. Perhaps I'm biased because I worked for McLaren for many years, but it always seemed to me that Ferrari got a better run of the regulatory balls than McLaren did. And as for your question about Jerez 1997, when, as you say, 3 drivers recorded the exact same pole time, no, I certainly don't think that was rigged. I'll tell you why. If it had been rigged, only the 2 World Championship contenders would have tied for pole, Schumacher and Villeneuve. The addition of Frentzen actually, in one way, kind of spoiled the gladiatorial beauty, if we can call it that, of what would otherwise have been, dramatic stopwatch symmetry. I thought Ecclestone must have hated that. He'd have preferred just the two.
My theory is that Schumacher and Villeneuve, a time was agreed upon, and Frentzen came along and recorded exactly the time that it had been agreed upon. So they had to include him. They couldn't do anything about it. Well, anyway, that's just me. I'm a conspiracy theorist.
Yes, and you sometimes think I'm naive because I'm such an innocent.
Of course you are.
But your theory is that they rigged the first one and then Frentzen, by coincidence, rained on their parade.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Answers on a postcard. What do you think, listeners? It's an interesting one. Anyway, I don't think that. But anyway, I think Bernie was much keener on masterminding big moves than, manipulating intricacies on the field of play, if I can put it that way. I mean, let's think about it. He finessed Jacques Villeneuve's move to Formula One, for example, because of the appeal of his surname, owing to his father, the great Gilles Villeneuve. Bernie had always wanted a world-class German Formula One driver. So when he saw at Spa in 1991 that Michael Schumacher was the real deal, and I think that was obvious to all of us, brilliant debut, qualifying 7th, blah, 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 he immediately finessed him into Benetton for the very next race. Why? Because Benetton had a much better chance of becoming a winning team than Jordan did. It was Jordan that Michael had made his Formula One debut for at Spa. And he did that, Bernie, because he wanted a German driver to be in a position to win Formula One Grand Prix and, in time, the Formula One Drivers' World Championship. And it worked. It happened. And here's another example, after Ayrton Senna had been killed at Imola in 1994, Bernie persuaded Mercedes, McLaren's engine partner in 1995, the following year, to put pressure on Ron Dennis, the McLaren boss, to run Nigel Mansell that year, meaning 1995. That happened. Mansell raced only twice for McLaren, actually, at the beginning of 1995.
Is it true that he just didn't fit the cockpit?
It is. I wasn't working there at the time. I started at McLaren many years later, 2008, but it is. Yeah. He missed the first two races because he couldn't get in the car. The cockpit was too small.
That's too narrow,
It's a more polite way of saying it than Nigel was too big. Yeah. Anyway, but he did then race the third and fourth races of the year, which was Imola and Barcelona. But he didn't get on with it. It didn't work out, and that was that. So he raced two races for McLaren in 1995. But even so, even though it didn't work out, it was an example of Bernie's big picture thinking. He realised that Formula One had lost a superstar, Senna, so he worked behind the scenes to bring in a replacement superstar, Mansell.
Yes, of course, Bernie had brought Mansell back from America, where he'd raced for a couple of years in IndyCar series. Mansell had gone to America in 93 as the reigning world F1 champion. And he'd nearly won the Indy 500, and he had won the IndyCar Series Championship, then had not such a good season in 94. And Bernie brought him back, and this was a kind of, return to the scene of former triumphs. Not quite.
Not quite, but I totally take your point, and I think he realised that Mansell was a star both sides of the Atlantic by that time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Anyway, as for Max Mosley, he stepped down from the presidency of the FIA eventually at the end of 2009 after a period of turmoil, another one, leading to the signing of a new Concord agreement. Luca di Montezemolo, the boss of Ferrari, told the Italian press that he'd engineered Max's removal, but Max always claimed it was of his own accord. And lest anyone think that all Max did during his presidency was conspire with Bernie to control F1, he did do some very good work in the road safety field, including bringing in much stricter crash test regulations for road cars. He was always very proud of that, I think with some justification.
I agree. I mean, Euro NCAP, he did a lot to further that.
He did. And he went out with a bang, or rather a double bang. There was the $100 million fine he inflicted on McLaren and Ron Dennis as a result of the Spygate scandal, and the lifetime bans on Flavio Briatore and Pat Simmons for their roles in the Crashgate affair in 2008. Both those bans were rescinded after Jean Todt succeeded Mosley as president. Actually, it was going out with a triple bang, since Max had also been photographed by the News of the World in, shall we say, a compromising situation situation. There was a lot of
filmed, not just photographed.
I beg your pardon. You've seen this, I imagine. And there was a lot of shock and horror when the film and pictures and the story appeared, and no doubt they contributed to Max's departure. And whatever the rights and wrongs of that, he'd become an unacceptably divisive figure at the head of a world governing body. And when Briatore successfully appealed against his ban, Ecclestone supported him.
Yes, he did. And I think it's worth mentioning here and now, that one of the only things Bernie ever did that he's expressed real regret about, as far as I can remember, was not supporting his old mate Max when the Bahrainis banned Max from attending their Grand Prix in the wake of the News of the World sting. Bernie has often, I think, quite contritely and quite believably expressed regret about that.
Yeah, I do think it said a bit about where his instinct lay, siding with the Bahraini ban,
yes,
instinctively rather than Max.
Yes,
when Max did actually have a very good case.
Yes. Another story. One day we will do a Max Mosley pod. We will. Anyway, as you say, Richard, FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, was formed in 2008, in July, during a meeting at Maranello. Now, the location was important, as was the identity of the host team, Ferrari, because previous rebellions had tended not to include Ferrari. Yet here was Luca di Montezemolo hosting the meeting and indeed agreeing to become the first FOTA president. And now I was working at McLaren at that time. 2008 was my first year there, actually. And I remember Ron Dennis aspiring to take on the FOTA presidency when, the next year, 2009, Di Montezemolo was planning to step down. But actually, the job went to Ron's deputy, Martin Whitmarsh. Martin loved his FOTA work, and he was pretty good at it too. He roped all of us McLaren guys into helping him. I mean, McLaren's in-house lawyers, in-house finance guys, in-house comms and PR guys such as me, and others besides. And for a while, it looked at one time as though there really might be a breakaway series. The issue at stake was the FIA's proposed budget cap, which ironically exists now in Formula One, and no one seems to moan about it that much. Formula One teams tend to quite quickly get used to things that they initially think are going to be a total disaster. We've seen that many times, haven't we? Yeah. Anyway, back to FOTA. When 4 teams pulled out of FOTA at the end of 2011, Ferrari, Sauber, Red Bull, and Toro Rosso. Basically it's 2 teams. It's Ferrari and its satellite team Sauber, because they had Ferrari engines, and Red Bull and its satellite team Toro Rosso, because Mateschitz owned both teams. Well, when that happened, the die was cast. Again, Bernie was playing divide and conquer, as successfully as ever. And the teams that left were apparently offered favourable commercial deals ahead of the new Concord Agreement, allegedly, which was signed in 2013. And FOTA ceased to exist the following year.
Yes, it did. And Bernie got his way, as he so often did.
Exactly.
In that case, he'd used his close relationship with Dietrich Mateschitz, the boss of Red Bull, to whom he'd steered Christian Horner, as it happened, when Mateschitz took over the Jaguar team and turned it into Red Bull. And Ecclestone had sort of talent spotted Horner, I think, and
he had. He'd said, "Here's a boy to watch."
Yep.
He was 31, Horner, in those days.
So Bernie used Mateschitz to break the team's solidarity. He had Red Bull and Toro Rosso, their sister team, signed up, and then Ferrari panicked and followed suit, and it was all over.
And then it was whatever, House of Cards, dominoes, whatever metaphor you want, but it was curtains.
Done.
That's 3 metaphors.
Yeah. Going back to the end of 2009, which was when Max eventually got ousted, Bernie was able to retain control for many years, despite F1's ownership changing hands several times, and despite the scandals he was involved in. After the 100-year deal was signed, various institutions bought shares in SLEC, the holding company for the Formula One groups. That's SLEC, S-L-E-C, standing for Slavica, S-L, Ecclestone, EC, Bernie's second wife. A German cable TV company bought a big chunk of shares and then collapsed, leading to the banks taking over its assets. And in 2006, one of those banks, the German bank Bayern Landesbank, sold its 47.2% stake in F1 to an investment company called CVC Capital Partners, who ran the sport for 10 years, with Bernie as a salaried chief executive. But that same sale is what led to Bernie facing bribery charges in the German courts in 2012, which he saw off by paying the German courts $100 million, with the case ending without presumption of guilt or innocence. And still he stayed on, because by that stage, no one could run Formula One like Bernie.
Absolutely, no one could.
I'm Kevin Roos.
And I'm Casey Newton.
We're technology reporters and the hosts of Hard Fork, a show from the New York Times.
A hard fork is a programming term for when you're building something, but it gets really screwed up. So you take the entire thing, break it, and start over.
And that's a little bit what it feels like right now in the tech industry. Like these companies that you and I have been writing about for the past decade, they're all kind of struggling to stay relevant.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the energy and money in Silicon Valley is shifting to totally new ideas. Crypto, the metaverse, AI. It feels like a real turning point.
And all this is happening so fast. Some of it's so strange. I just feel like I'm texting you constantly, like, what is this story? Explain this to me.
And so we're going to talk about these stories. We're going to bring in other journalists, newsmakers, whoever else is involved in building this future to explain to us what's changing and why it all matters.
Hard Fork from the New York Times.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Before the break, we spoke about Bernie's 2012 court case in Germany, where he was up on bribery charges but escaped any kind of sentence and carried on at the helm of Formula One. And one of the reasons he carried on is that CVC, the investment company that now owned Formula One, prior to its takeover by Liberty Media, the current owner, CVC knew that Bernie would keep bringing in the big bucks. The odd scandal, and there was some, didn't really matter so long as Formula One continued to grow. And as we mentioned in the last episode, one of the things Bernie did when he took control of the TV rights was to persuade TV companies to buy Formula One as a package, rather than pay for individual Grand Prix on an ad hoc basis as they had in the past. That, along with much better organised race weekend programmes and guaranteed starting grids of a uniform number of cars for each Grand Prix, because that wasn't the case before. Sometimes you used to read reports where it said the starting time was scheduled for 2:00 and eventually the cars got to the grid at 2:45. Do you remember reading Jenks in Motorsport, that kind of thing? Sure. And again, some races there were 16 cars, some races there were 26 cars or anything in between. That was a thing. Anyway, because that was streamlined and the starting times obviously had to be perfect for TV scheduling, and the number of cars was also...
And of course it got rid of the chaos of pre-qualifying and all that thing. When, no Ferrari was in danger of not pre-qualifying.
No, exactly.
So the teams were guaranteed places on the grid.
Bernie knew how many commercial beans made five. Yeah. Anyway, all of those improvements and streamlinings vastly improved the TV product, which in turn vastly increased TV viewing figures, which in turn vastly helped the sport's popularity to grow at an exponential rate. In fact, I've often thought that Bernie started to get really rich when he worked out how to monetize the two T's. I'm referring to two T's which are much, much harder to monetize nowadays, actually. Television and tobacco. And we'll talk a bit about tobacco later in this pod. We've just talked about television. Actually, we probably talk about television a bit later as well. But the other way Bernie raked in the cash was with an aggressive expansion of the Formula One calendar, wasn't it, Richard?
Yes, seeing that the fees paid by individual race promoters were the next big source of income after TV revenue, Bernie did two things. He increased the number of races per season, and he expanded into new markets where F1 had never been before, and simultaneously turning his back on more traditional venues if they wouldn't front up more cash or improve their facilities and infrastructure. When Bernie established FOTA in 1987, there were 16 races on the F1 calendar. When he was replaced as F1's chief executive in 2017, following Liberty's takeover, there were 20 races. And that might not sound like much of an increase, but those additional races all netted hundreds of millions of dollars more per year. And the long list of other countries queuing up for a race forced the traditional venues to stump up more to protect their places on the calendar.
Yes, they did. And for better or worse, Formula One expanded to all these brand new venues under Bernie's stewardship. I'll list them, I think, actually. Melbourne in Australia, not a new country, but a new city, because the race, of course, had been in Adelaide before it transferred to Melbourne in 1996, it was. Sepang in Malaysia, the first Asian Formula One Grand Prix outside Japan, and an earner in terms of the involvement of the Malaysian government and tourist board, Visit Malaysia as it was called, and I think it is still called, an earner for Bernie and Bernie's companies. Then Singapore, next door to Malaysia, but more lucrative, and therefore the race that ended up shunting Malaysia out of the Formula One calendar. And the first Formula One night race too, a novelty at the time. Indianapolis in the United States, not a new country, but a new city and a new circuit for Formula One, and a legendary one, of course, at that. Then Austin, Texas, United States. Sakhir in Bahrain. Yas Marina in Abu Dhabi, moving into the Gulf states, again lucrative for Bernie and his companies. Shanghai and New Delhi in China and India, the world's two most populous countries, earners again for Bernie and his companies. Mokpo in Korea, Istanbul in Turkey, both big populations, both big earners. Sochi, Russia, of course, a huge population, Russia. Baku in Azerbaijan too, again, good earners.
Not such a big population in Azerbaijan, but lots of money.
Lots of money, lots of money. Oh, and lest we forget Valencia in Spain to take advantage of the enormous growing popularity of Fernando Alonso in that country. And of course, Liberty Media has added quite a few more new venues since Bernie's time, but those ones I listed were the ones that were added in Bernie's time.
Yeah, and that deal for a Grand Prix in Russia, incidentally, came after Bernie'd had a 15-minute private meeting with Vladimir Putin. Sochi happens to be where Putin has his winter palace and where the 2014 Winter Olympics were staged. And at one point, just after the invasion of Ukraine began, Bernie observed that he would be prepared to, quote, take a bullet for Putin, unquote. Quote again, he's a good person, he said, and he's doing what he believes is right for Russia. And I'm afraid that rather reminded people of the time Bernie had expressed the view that Adolf Hitler at least knew how to get things done. Of course, this was all consistent with his tendency to go off-piste in his opinions in interviews when he was talking spontaneously. Women, he once said, should all wear white like other domestic appliances. Possibly that was his idea of a joke, do you think, Matt?
Probably it was. I think a lot of these things were his idea of at least mischief.
Yeah, mischief. That's
yes,
a good
yes.
word. Yeah. And while being interviewed in a restaurant by a female journalist from The Times, he remarked, waiters are like hookers, never around when you want them.
I remember reading that and just cringing when I read it.
Anyway, why didn't all those things get him cast out of polite society or cancelled, as people would probably say today? I suppose, like Boris Johnson, first time we've mentioned him on this podcast.
Hopefully
and
the last. Hopefully the last.
But maybe Bernie, like Johnson, is one of those living self-caricatures whose outrageousness is, as they say, priced in and therefore kind of accepted as part of life's rich and varied tapestry. Anyway, back to the circuits. About $280 million was spent on building a new track for the Russian Grand Prix, and whenever a new track like Sochi was being planned, Bernie sent along Herman Tilke, his preferred autodrome architect. These places were often in featureless locations and resulted in horrors like Bahrain and Abu Dhabi. They became known as Tilkedromes, and that wasn't meant kindly. Lessons were learned, though. Istanbul was good, and so was Austin, although that one was designed as a kind of jigsaw of bits borrowed from existing circuits. I like Baku quite a lot, too.
I liked Sepang, to be fair, too. Did you?
Yes, decent circuit.
Yeah, you could go 3 abreast round some of the turns.
Yeah, they're not all rubbish.
Yes.
Even though some of them like telegraph poles and walls and ditches and barbed wire fences.
Cobblestones.
And, cattle and the kind of thing, the kind of thing we tend to prefer.
Yes. Although you can still, we're into silly digressions, but you can still, in Canada, you can still run into a groundhog, can't you?
Yes.
And in Austria, a deer.
Scenery, local colour. Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back to a serious podcast. You mentioned Ecclestone's controversies. Well, there were other controversies too. For example, he donated £1 million to the Labour Party in January 1997, although his donation wasn't made public at the time. It was actually Mosley's idea. Max had met Tony Blair, the leader of the Labour Party at the time, at Silverstone, the British Grand Prix, in 1996, and he'd been impressed by him. Max had been impressed by Blair. Then, obviously, Labour won a general election, a landslide, on May the 1st, 1997, and they duly formed the government. Well, it's always been claimed that Bernie's £1 million donation had absolutely nothing to do with Labour's decision to exempt Formula One from the tobacco advertising and promotion ban that it had announced on May the 19th, just 18 days after the general election, thereby granting Formula One a stay of execution that allowed Formula One teams to continue to be sponsored by tobacco brands long after every other sport had been prevented from doing so in the UK and indeed in many other countries too. Labour's claim, if I may say so, Labour's claim that there was no link between the two was greeted with an enormous amount of scepticism, as you probably remember, Richard.
Yeah.
And of course, famously, having tried to hush up the existence of the Ecclestone donation, finally, in November 1997, the Labour Party was forced to admit that it had indeed received £1 million from the Formula One boss and that it would give it back. It actually apparently took a little while for the donation to be returned because the Labour Party didn't have enough funds to pay it immediately, allegedly. Anyway, so that was another fantastic Ecclestone deal, wasn't it? And very Bernie. Why? Because he got exactly what Formula One needed, a stay of execution in terms of tobacco advertising and promotion, and he got his money back too. Pure Bernie.
And even after all of the controversy, it wasn't until January 2017, 30 years after the establishment of FOTA, that he was removed as chief executive of F1 by the new and current owners, Liberty Media. It was a bit of a sad end in a way. I went to interview him for Motorsport magazine in 2018, the year after he stepped down or was moved aside. He was given the title of Chairman Emeritus, but he made it very clear to me that it came with no function and no power, and he seemed a bit wistful about it. When I asked him if he missed the paddock, he said, quote, "I miss it so much I don't think about it. I'm not going to say that I miss this, I miss that, and I miss the other, because you miss the whole lot if you've been doing something for 40 years, the way Max and I used to try and keep things together. We were very close. With the current FIA setup, I think it's a bit different."
That's quite an interesting quote, almost showing a little bit of human frailty or vulnerability. which is not his habit.
It's not, no. I was surprised at the time, but you never know with Bernie. He may have been trying to send another message at the
He
same
might have
time.
thought, it's the Guardian. I'll probably have to show I've got a good soul.
Well, it was motorsport. So
Oh, well,
I don't know.
then maybe it was genuine.
There was a time, actually, 10 or 12 years ago, you'll probably remember, when Bernie was, I think, less famous for running F1 than for being the father of two daughters, Tamara and Petra. He'd been divorced by their mother, Slavica, who left with an £800 million settlement after a 23-year marriage. One of the daughters lived in a house in Kensington Palace Gardens that cost £75 million. The other in a house in the Hollywood Hills costing £54 million. Although, like a true Ecclestone, she sold it for £95 million when she got divorced.
These are eye-watering sums, aren't they? Yeah.
And those daughters lived lifestyles to match their surroundings. And for a while, Tamara actually had her own reality TV show called Tamara Ecclestone, Billion Dollar Girl.
Marvellous.
And when I talked to Bernie about all that for The Guardian in 2011, he seemed acutely embarrassed by their conspicuous spending, not least by the fact that Petra's wedding had cost 12 million quid, featuring an Italian palazzo with an orchestra, Andrea Bocelli, the tenor, Eric Clapton, the guitarist, and wine, Chateau Petrus, if you really want to know, at £4,000 a bottle. The drinks bill came to £800,000. And no doubt...
I am speechless. Well, I know I've just spoken, but I am speechless.
And no doubt all that was enabled by his decision to put 3 billion quid of his wealth into an offshore trust called Bambino Holdings, to which, for tax reasons, only his ex-wife and daughters had access. And he told me, quote, the idea was that they'd buy super quality property that would be long-term for their kids and everything else. Didn't happen. They haven't done that, so they've had access to money which they've spent, unquote.
I don't think Bernie thought money was for spending in quite that way.
Not in
Although he has spent money, obviously, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and certainly if you did spend it in that way, you didn't show it off.
No.
And there were other stories. You remember he got mugged twice outside his own house. One of those times, his £25,000 Hublot watch was stolen. And next thing you know, there's a newspaper advert in the FT, I think, for the watch company showing Bernie's bruised face and the line, some people will do anything for a Hublot.
I remember that. What
Brilliant
kind of, guerrilla reactive marketing.
Yeah, and great Bernie to participate in it as well.
Exactly.
I'm sure he got his watch replaced free.
Well, and probably a bit more than that.
Probably a bit more, yeah. And then, of course, his nose was badly bitten by an Alsatian during a visit to Steve Wynn, the Las Vegas casino magnate. And you have to think that's one brave Alsatian.
Absolutely.
So maybe it's not all that surprising that when he was arrested getting off a private jet in Brazil, where he and his third wife, Fabiana Flossi, have a coffee plantation, it was for illegal possession of a gun.
When you say coffee plantation, I mean, it's about as big as Wales.
Not 8 football pitches.
No.
Wales.
Well,
Okay.
Not actually, but it's huge,
Yeah,
apparently.
yeah.
It's huge.
And then just a year ago, in October 2023, at the end of a long investigation by HMRC, the British tax authorities, he agreed to pay £650 million to cover unpaid tax, interest and civil penalties. And he accepted a 17-month prison sentence suspended for 2 years. 650 million quid. Think about that when you're doing your next tax returns.
Yes, I do have to pay a tax return quite soon, and it's made me feel quite sanguine about it.
Yep.
Anyway, Tamara Ecclestone, obviously, as we've said, Bernie and Slavica's elder daughter, once spent £1 million on the purchase of a crystal bathtub.
Hang on a minute, Matt. Bernie assured me in a very important Guardian exclusive that it was nothing like £1 million.
Well, that was probably the truth, and it may even have been nothing but the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Because Tamara was quoted in the Daily Mail as follows. When she was asked about that exact rumour, she was asked by the journalist, is it true you spent £1 million on a bathtub? She said, quote, and I'm reading it, It's completely true. They've gone to find this crystal, which will be turned into my bathtub. It's costing £1 million because I've got to reinforce the floor and I've had to pay for everyone's travel and the hauling back and polishing of the crystal. But I spend a lot of time in the bath, so it's worth it.
And with that thought in our minds, it's time for our final ad break.
Absolutely.
This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC. This episode is supported by Merill. With a dedicated Merill advisor, you get a personalized plan for your financial goals. And when plans change, Merrill's with you every step of the way. Go to ml.com/bullish to learn more. Merill, a Bank of America company. What would you like the power to do? Investing involves risk. Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner & Smith Incorporated, registered broker-dealer. Registered investment advisor. Member SIPC.
Welcome back. So, in this final part of the pod, we should probably talk about Bernie's legacy. Matt, what would you say were Bernie's greatest accomplishments as the so-called F1 Supremo?
Absolutely. I wouldn't even say so-called, as the Formula One Supremo. He was. Okay. So, how will I answer it? I think, as I say, he worked out how to monetize tobacco and television, the two T's, better than anyone else ever has. He became extremely wealthy in so doing. But to be fair, he made a lot of other people extremely wealthy along the way too. I mean, people like Eddie Jordan. You know, Eddie's a great guy, but he wouldn't have become a multi-millionaire other than by hitching a ride on Ecclestone's coattails. And EJ wasn't the only one.
No, that's a really, really important point. There are a lot of people who owed their fortunes to what he did.
Well, such as yourself. That's why you're a multi-millionaire.
No,
exactly.
Don't tell HMRC.
Anyway, Ecclestone's understanding of how to package up a sport for TV was his ultimate achievement, I think. You have to remember, let's just go back a bit. You have to remember that before Bernie came along, Formula One was kind of almost a minority sport. In the UK, football obviously was far bigger, the biggest sport. But so was rugby bigger than Formula One. So was cricket. So was snooker. Yes, actually, snooker. And get this, so perhaps for a short time was bowls. I mean, in the 1970s and 80s, David Bryant, you remember him, don't you?
Yeah.
David Bryant, who played bowls while smoking a pipe, was a TV superstar. And so were snooker players such as Ray Reardon and Alex Higgins and Jimmy White and others.
Yeah, mostly F1 got headlines when somebody died, didn't
exactly,
it? You know?
Exactly.
As far as I remember, nobody died playing bowls or snooker, although I may be wrong.
Well, answers on a postcard again. Anyway, Ecclestone did something very clever in terms of making Formula One work as a compelling, year-round television narrative. He understood that the way Formula One was structured, in fact, before he came along, in other words, as a world championship wherein every individual round counts for points, an equal number of points, and a driver becomes world champion by scoring more points in cumulative total than any of his rivals. Well, that makes Formula One uniquely well suited to becoming that compelling year-round TV narrative. And as such, the drivers had to, and indeed obviously wanted to, compete in every round. I mean, think about how many sports don't do that. Most of them, actually.
Yeah, and in fact, before Bernie came along, the arrangement in Formula One was you could only score points in a certain number of races each season. So if there were 10 races, only your best results from 6 races, say, count. So you could miss races.
With impunity, sometimes.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And in fact, I don't know if it ever happened, but if you'd scored maximum points, then you got to the situation where there was no point entering the last one because you couldn't add to your points total.
No.
Anyway, theoretically, that could have happened. But anyway, let's just talk about some other big sports where that is not the case. For example, tennis is a big sport, and today's top tennis players are absolute superstars. But each tournament is a stand-alone event. As a result, British tennis fans watch Wimbledon, but they kind of tend not to bother with the French Open. Well, not unless they're proper die-hard tennis fans anyway. Ditto golf. American golf fans watch the US Open and the Masters at Augusta, but they tend not to bother with the British Open. Again, not unless they're die-hard golf fans. So, in terms of mapping other sports against the Formula One model, just imagine that if Carlos Alcaraz had to win the Vienna Open to be crowned tennis world champion, well, Spanish fans would suddenly watch the Vienna Open. Spanish tennis fans, obviously. In the same way, just imagine if Rory McIlroy had to win the FedEx St. Jude Golf Championship in Memphis, Tennessee, to be crowned world golf champion. Again, British golf fans would suddenly watch the FedEx St. Jude Golf Championship in Memphis, Tennessee, which they don't now. And so would everyone else. And honestly, I believe this. If Bernie Ecclestone had got hold of tennis or golf instead of getting hold of Formula One all those years ago, that's how tennis and golf would be run now. I firmly believe that. And now TV companies, therefore, if Bernie had got hold of tennis or golf in that way, TV companies would be falling over one another in their efforts not only to televise Wimbledon tennis and the Augusta Masters golf, but also the Vienna Open tennis and the FedEx St. Jude Golf Championship in Memphis, Tennessee. It's no coincidence, in my opinion, that the world's most popular sport, football, runs on national leagues with points for every win, equal number of points for every win, just like Formula One, in fact. Okay, of course, there are huge standalone football events too, which are run, to knockout formats. Obviously the World Cup, par excellence. But the bread and butter of football is leagues. And the Formula One World Championship is just that. It's a league. It means that every race matters to the same degree, whether it be in Monaco or in Baku. And Bernie understood how to turn that into megabucks before and better than anyone else in the world.
So that's what he did right. What did he get wrong? First, he didn't get the modern age, the age of the internet. He charged ridiculous fees for the use of F1 footage in documentaries and films. And by doing that, he was restricting access instead of encouraging it. And as soon as he was gone, everything changed in that respect. Drive to Survive would never have happened on his watch. And that Netflix series has brought in a whole new generation of young fans around the world. But he wasn't interested in them. Young fans, he said, didn't buy Rolex watches, one of F1's biggest sponsors.
He did actually say that on the record, didn't he?
Yeah, he did, on the record.
He did.
And what he didn't see was that young fans sometimes grow up to be people with an interest in expensive watches.
This is why
and they've grown up in awareness of that brand.
This is why banks advertise to youngsters, not because they think 17-year-olds, they're going to make a lot of money out of 17-year-olds now, but because 17-year-olds are going to become 57.
Yeah.
And some of them might be millionaires.
Yeah, it's interesting. Bernie just didn't want to see that anyway. Yeah. And he also alienated a lot of established fans, older fans, including me, when he almost destroyed Silverstone in a feud with the circuit's owners, the British Racing Drivers Club, whom he detested. Do you remember when he moved the British Grand Prix to Easter, resulting in thousands of spectators' cars at Silverstone getting stuck in muddy car parks? That was an absolute nightmare. And behind it, there was a kind of sinister glee at work. He could see this terrible mess that the BRDC were in. And that was very Joe Pesci, if you remember the comparison I made.
I do. And actually... I remember, again, a typical Ecclestone quote at the time, him being asked about Silverstone and saying, I like Silverstone. It reminds people what Formula One used to be like.
That's brilliant.
Always double-edged.
That's brilliant. But, in the process, he forced Silverstone into spending 25 million quid on the wing and changing the configuration of the circuit. Now, you may like it. To me, I don't. To me, Copse Corner is always the first, is turn one in the modern parlance.
I'm with you.
Good.
I preferred it as it was.
Yeah. And the wing actually isn't even any good from the spectator's point of view, because you buy a ticket in the grandstand opposite the pits and you can't see anything happening in the pits. But
I know.
There we are. And Bernie also sanctioned the really bad idea of giving double points for the final race of the season, which happened to be in Abu Dhabi that year, where the promoters were happy to pay a premium for the privilege.
Thankfully, that only happened once.
It did, yeah. I mean, there's sort of sense of that. But it was a really daft idea.
And thankfully, it didn't affect the World Championship. Imagine if it had been won because of that.
Yes. Imagine the race being distorted in the last race of the season. Who
that could never happen.
Imagine such a thing?
Never.
Anyway, it was things like that and Ferrari's special payments that made F1 seem like a sport driven by cynicism and greed, which was a real drag if you'd grown up when it was motivated by very different instincts.
Yeah, I think, yes, all this is true, Richard. But Bernie Ecclestone was the master of his time. But every dog has his day. Or, to maintain my canine theme, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And despite his early investment in Bakersville, as it was called, Formula One's digital village, Bernie never really understood the growing importance of social media, as you say. But he wasn't the only one. Look, Facebook was launched in 2004. I remember authorising one of my comms and PR team at McLaren, Georgina Larby it was, to give her credit, to quietly launch our McLaren Facebook channel. And it was her idea. She said to me, "Shall we do this?" I said, "Well, go on then." And she did. Anyway, that was the first McLaren social media channel of them all. And that would have been in about, I think, 2008, so probably 4 or 5 years after Facebook was launched. Ron Dennis absolutely didn't get it. Not at all. He wondered why on earth we were wasting our time with it. Now, Ron was 61 in 2008, but Bernie was 78 in 2008. So, of course, Bernie didn't get Facebook. He didn't get any of the social media channels. As one by one they became obviously important to younger people and therefore obviously commercially significant. But I don't really blame him for that. As I say, he was already closer to 80 than 70 when even Facebook began to attract widespread interest, let alone any of the newer social media platforms. But what I can say, and I will say, and this is important, and just in case anybody has misinterpreted some of the things that we've said, without Bernie Ecclestone, Formula One would not be the global, sporting, technical, cultural and commercial powerhouse that it is today. And Bernie is the only person about whom you could say that sentence. Do you agree?
Yeah, you missed out spiritual.
Spiritual. I thought you were going to say I missed out Enzo Ferrari. No. But Bernie really is the person who made Formula One what it is.
Certainly.
Absolutely. And I want to say one more thing. We're coming towards the end quite soon, so I just want to say myself one more thing about him. At Spa in 2000, the year 2000, I interviewed him for F1 Racing magazine. And on the morning of our interview, a Belgian newspaper had carried an interview with him, and it included the following quote from him in French, but it was translated as, "I fear nothing, not even death." And obviously I read that before I interviewed him later that day. And I asked him, and I'm reading from the interview I wrote, "Did you really say that?" I asked him. "Probably not, but even if I didn't, it's true anyway," he replied. "Really? You've never felt fear in your whole life?" I asked him. "No," he replied.
I opened his Christmas card the other day. He still sends them to me. I don't know why. I've written some pretty horrible things about him over the years, but he must be a more generous and forgiving spirit than perhaps we think. But anyway, he always has his cards specially designed with some sort of cartoon in which he makes a barbed comment about the state of the world or Formula One. So last year I was surprised to read this message printed above a drawing of a snowbound, peaceful English country lane. Quote, "I'm sorry that I couldn't think of anything exciting or strange that's happened this year that could be illustrated on my usual card. So may I wish you a peaceful and happy end of the year with 2024 bringing you all that is good for you and a more settled world." That all seemed a bit out of character until I remembered the tax payment. He was being ironic, of course. And for this year's card, there's a drawing of a fat cat, an overweight feline, that is, not a businessman, smoking a cigar and saying, "I've found the key to happiness, as it hasn't been a peaceful world, with too many people suffering through no fault of their own, with the future not showing that a change is close by. I decided to find the best way to relax. Stay away from idiots. Bernie."
I mean, it's hardly jingle bells, is it? It's hardly gold, frankincense and myrrh.
Oh, there's plenty of gold there.
There's plenty of gold. But it's hardly the baby Jesus,
Nope,
is it?
It's not the baby Jesus.
But although that message is almost ostentatiously un-Christmassy, it's quintessentially Bernie. He is what he is. There's no one else like him. Never was, never will be. Here's a quote. Oscar Wilde said, "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." That's Bernie. Or, as Frank Sinatra famously crooned, one has to use the word croon about Frank Sinatra. I think it's obligatory, isn't it? "I did it my way." I'm not going to sing it. Are you, Richard?
Certainly not.
No. Well, again, that was pure Bernie. You can probably tell me who wrote the lyrics to My Way, can't you, Richard?
Well, I could, but I really don't want to. Matt's hideous song, heard at all the worst funerals.
Oh, dear.
So, to finish off, or almost, here's something I wrote in The Guardian in 2009, at the height of the Crashgate scandal, when it was discovered that Renault had deliberately engineered a crash in the Singapore Grand Prix the year before. And I was looking ahead to the day Bernie and Max would leave F1, and here's what I wrote. "Behind them, the pair will leave a sport stripped of its integrity, the old values replaced by a superficial prosperity that can no longer conceal a putrescent core." Pompous, huh? But anyway, was I right? Only from the perspective of the traditionalist, the purist, the hopelessly nostalgic, all of which I am sometimes, but not always. And that prosperity certainly wasn't superficial. That was real. And times change, of course. And Bernie had his flaws and his limitations. But yes, it's fair, as you suggested, to say that F1 is what it is today, a gaudy and glittering global entertainment because of the platform he built in the days when he was all-powerful. But really, Matt, to finish with, let's not forget that at 94 years old, he maintains a close friendship with Flavio Briatore, who's back in F1 at Alpine, and that his current wife, Fabiana, a lawyer, now has a senior role at the FIA, and that they have a 4-year-old son, Ace. What's your prediction about the future of the Ecclestone influence on F1? How far into the century might it extend?
ACE stands for Alexander Charles Ecclestone, doesn't it?
Does it?
I think it does.
It was Ace.
I don't think his name is Ace. I think its nickname is Ace, and it's Alexander Charles Ecclestone.
Okay.
Again, if I've got that wrong, answers on a postcard, but I think it's the case. Anyway, I'm going to give you a bit of an outlandish prediction. Now, Bernie's 94. He might live to be 104, but even Bernie is going to have to pass away one day. And Fabiana is in her 40s. I'm going to... Remember where you heard it first. I think she is going to be the president of the FIA one day. I think
she might be the commercial rights holder too, so she might be Bernie and Max in
combined.
One. Who knows?
Or maybe she'll be the president of the FIA and Ace will be the commercial rights holder. And Bernie will be sitting up in the clouds, directing it all, alongside St. Peter.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with any
After
of
all, he was born in St. Peter, the village of St. Peter in Suffolk.
that. I can't follow that.
And that feels like a good place to say, and colossally, that's history, and wrap up not just this episode, but season 2 of the pod as well. As we said at the top of the show, we've had an absolute blast making these podcasts. A lot goes into them, but it's worth it to see so many of you out there enjoying them. And thank you so much for your feedback.
Yeah, and just thank you very much for listening. As ever, we welcome your thoughts, your feedback, and even if we can't reply to every tweet or email, we can assure you we read them all, as we do with your kind reviews and comments on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.
Yes, and if you do want to get in touch, you can do so by emailing podcasts@the-race.com or via social media. I'm at the Bish F1 and Richard is at rwilliams1947.
And as we record this episode, Christmas is coming up, so if you want to buy someone a Colossally t-shirt as a present, or just treat yourself indeed, head to The Race Shop. There's a link in the description.
And one more plug before we go. If you want to listen to this or any of the Race's other fine podcasts ad-free, why not join the Race Members Club, where there are also tons of bonus episodes of the Race F1 podcast, Bring Back V10s and more. Again, head to the link in the description.
So that's it for this week and indeed this year. Until next time, with thanks to our esteemed and long-suffering producer, Johnny Reynolds, and to you for listening, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.